I'm Timothy Naftali. I'm director of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum in Yorba Linda, California. It's December 8th, 2008, and I have the honor and privilege to be interviewing Senator Trent Lott for the Nixon Oral History Program. Senator Lott, thanks for doing this.
It's a pleasure to be with you. I've, for many years, been a tremendous fan of President Nixon, and he's one of the reasons why I ran for office, and one of the reasons I was able to reach leadership positions in the Congress.
Well, let's start. I want to, having read your book, Herding Cats, which is very interesting, I want to ask you about the conversation. You talk about discussions you had with Yale law professors when you were at Ole Miss Law School that you say had an effect in creating a backlash, if you will, that you and Ted Cochran and Haley Barbour. And given that we want students to understand the nature of American politics in the Nixon era, could you tell us a little bit about what those conversations were like?
Well, in the late 60s, we had quite a group of Yale law professors, some of them recent graduates, that came to the University of Mississippi sort of on a mission to help lead the poor country, uneducated, unwashed masses out of the woods. And they started taking positions which on matters of constitutional law, not just civil rights and human rights, that we, many of us, did not agree with. I had one friend that very intelligent, wound up getting his PhD in economics and being a professor and heading a college program, who argued with him and paid the price. Wound up being basically, he didn't flunk out, but he basically gave it up and left. But what happened was during that era, which would have been in 65, 66, 67, we started to studying together and trying to develop the arguments to the contrary on issues of constitutional law, criminal law, you name it. And I really think it made us better thinkers. Sometime if academia pushes the envelope too far one way or the other, it has the reverse effect. Rather than having a freewheeling, open, unbiased position or discussion. But I think it created a whole generation of people that did think about what they believed in and wound up being in political office and helping to move the state of Mississippi from one-party state, Democrat, to pretty much one-party state, Republican. And we're in the South, you'll always have that mix. But it did have an effect on a whole generation of lawyers and subsequently politicians.
How much of that do you think was a cultural backlash?
I think that was part of it. It wasn't so much the positions they were taking. And remember, those were times where they were very far-reaching pieces of legislation that were passing the Congress in the 60s. And so we wrote our papers. We took topics. In fact, I wrote one of my papers on the 1964. I think it was civil. I'm trying to remember exactly what it was, but there was one of the 64 Civil Rights Acts, which had to do with public facilities and all. I wrote my paper on that subject, and didn't necessarily take a contrarian point of view. But that's what we were debating, and I think a lot of it, though, as your question points out, it was style to a degree. It was attitude. It was many of them were from New York. One of them was even from Australia. The guy that taught us constitutional law was actually from Australia, and the best we could determine had only had one more constitutional law course than we had had. Because most of us had taken the con law class in undergraduate school as a part of business school or even liberal arts if you were going to go to law school. And then you get into law school, and that first year course you take constitutional law. So this Yale graduate came down and was teaching us constitutional law, and in some respects we thought maybe we knew as much or more than he did. So maybe it was our attitude too. I found him extremely likable, I might say, and developed a real friendship with him. And one of those Yale law professors was a guy by the name of Michael Horowitz, who wound up being a neocon, wound up working in the, I guess it was the Reagan White House for the Office of Management and Budget for David Stockman, which I thought was a curious turn of events. Maybe we converted him.
Mrs. Lott convinces you to go to Washington.
My wife did have an impact on it. I was practicing law in my hometown. Had just been elected president of JC's. I'd just been appointed as a public defender by the circuit judge, and so things were going pretty well. And I'd always wanted to go back to my hometown and practice law and maybe get in politics, maybe run for district attorney. So I was laboring with this decision to go into Washington to work for my predecessor, Congressman Bill Colmer. And she just said, no, let's do it, it'll be a good experience. A couple of years in Washington, we can come back and live happily ever after, and you can do whatever you want to, practice law or in politics. And with that kind of attitude, that affected me, and we loaded up the car. Didn't even have a U-Haul. We just put what we would get in the car, took our one-year-old son, and we came to Washington. Rented an apartment on Capitol Hill, had rental furniture, and stayed 40 years.
Not with rental furniture, though.
No, we did finally get to where we could afford more than rental furniture.
Did you live with Lamar Alexander at any
Yeah, we did. When I first came up in Washington in 1968, I guess it was like in April of that year, and I wasn't sure that I would like it enough to stay, and I didn't have a place for my wife and our son. So I made arrangements through a friend of mine, also from Mississippi, from Gulfport, Mississippi, that worked for the Federal Maritime Administration, to stay with a group of 5 bachelors over close to what is now the Vice President's residence. And one of the 5 bachelors was Lamar Alexander, who was then working for Howard Baker. And it was quite an experience because they were all unmarried, and I had my one little bedroom, and they'd get up at sunrise and they would work all day, get home late, and party half the night. And after about 3 months, I said, you guys are crazy. I can't make it here. I'm going to get my family, and we're going to live somewhere else. But we've been good friends since 1968 when I first met Lamar.
There's a wonderful moment in your book where you have a chat with old William Colmer about whether he's a Republican or a Democrat.
Yep.
Could you tell that story for us, please?
Well, we used to, in those days, there was a very different atmosphere on Capitol Hill. Members had more of a personal relationship. You didn't have fax machines, the internet, cell phones. Members got, I think, maybe 6 round trips a year to go home, so they didn't go home, even every month, and certainly not every weekend like they do now. So in the afternoons, by about 5:15, we had answered all the mail, answered all the phone calls, and I'd go in and mix him an old Granddad and Coke. That's a cheap bourbon, because he was, he was a real fiscally conservative Democrat. I mean, he was too cheap to drink expensive bourbon. And he'd light up a cigar, and we'd reminisce, and we'd talk about life and his experiences and philosophy and candidates for president and all of the above. And so I asked him, I said, well, Mr. Colmer, you vote like a Republican. Why are you a Democrat? And the answer was pretty simple, really. I've been here 36 years, 38 years. I'm pretty much, cast to stay where I am. But the next generation may want to do it differently. He didn't try to defend, his party, but philosophically, he was very close to people like Gerald Ford, H. Allen Smith, who was the ranking Republican from California on the Rules Committee, Mendel Rivers, who was the Republican whip. They were the ones that he really was the closest to, except for the older Democrats, people like George Mahon from Texas, who was chairman of appropriations. But he was very fond of John Rhodes, for instance, from Arizona, who went on to be the Republican leader. So, I asked him questions about that, and we had some philosophical discussions. I always was a little bit more sympathetic toward education and federal funds for education, but he always said, just remember, the federal dollar federal control will follow the federal dollar. But we did talk about why he was a Democrat, and he was very much a fan of Richard Nixon. And I remember in that 1968 election talking to him about that and why it was important. And the thing he said that always has stuck with me. He said, because I know that Richard Nixon will appoint the kind of federal judges and Supreme Court judges that I would believe in and could support. He thought that was perhaps the most important thing that would be determined by the election.
There was some interesting legislation in the period when you're working for Mr. Colmer, for Congressman Colmer, environmental legislation.
Yeah.
This is a period of expansion of federal responsibilities.
Right.
Do you recall how the congressman and you felt about this?
Well, Mr. Colmer very much was opposed to government activism and intervention. Like most of us from Mississippi, we love the outdoors. We love fishing and hunting, and there's a certain, people don't really realize it, but there's a certain preservation streak in people from our part of the country. And I've created a scenic river, and Mr. Colmer created the Gulf Islands National Seashore. We really get upset when people try to cut down a live oak tree, things like that. But in terms of the activism by the administration or by the Interior Department, Mr. Colmer was pretty leery about doing that. So I guess over the years he voted no more than he voted yes on just about anything. And as I stayed in the Congress, that was one of the things that I shifted on from what he did. I just didn't think it was good enough to say no to everything. The answer was to find a way of getting things done where the federal government supports the private sector, or try to get programs created that use the free enterprise system rather than just saying no. Excuse me.
During this period before you are elected, do you ever interact with the Nixon White House conservatives, Tom Charles
Sure.
Houston
Yeah.
or Pat Buchanan? Or
Well, of course, I followed their activities, but the defining thing for me and for my state in terms of our relationship with Richard Nixon was Hurricane Camille in 1969, which was a devastating hurricane. We thought the worst probably you'd ever see in a lifetime, and then Katrina came along. But Richard Nixon and his staff came to Gulfport, Mississippi right after Hurricane Camille. And it's one of those visions or sights in my life I will never forget. When that Air Force One landed at Gulfport Biloxi Airport with that beautiful gleaming blue and white with that flag on the tail, I mean, I had tears in my eyes. And he basically came and he got off that plane, didn't stay very long, and he said, I'm here to tell you, your government is going to stand with you. We're going to help you get through this. And it converted that whole region of the state to Richard Nixon's party, really. I think it had a lot to do with it. And he kept his word. In those days, things were done very differently than they have been done by FEMA. For one thing, the Corps of Engineers didn't contract with people to come in and do the work. They came in and did the work. They brought in the bulldozers and the graders and the workers, and they helped us clean that mess up, and it made a huge difference. And then I flew back on a small Lear jet with several of what was then Nixon White House staff, some of whom I've stayed in touch with over the years. Pat Buchanan was not on that plane, but I think that's probably, if I had to point to a moment when I really said, you know what, I'm comfortable with these people. They're coming to see us when we're hurting the worst. I like them on a personal basis, and that had a lot to do with the rest of my life and certainly my political career.
you run as a Republican, you surprise a lot of people by winning, and then you come to Washington. How is it that you get on the Judiciary Committee?
Well, I was looking at the demographics, working with Mr. Colmer. I got access to some of the polling numbers. But when I ran, I think that maybe in the district I was running in, then the 5th Congressional District of Mississippi, 8% of the people identified themselves as Republican. But if you studied the internals, the majority of them were Republican. And I also knew, quite honestly, they were going to vote for Richard Nixon by overwhelming numbers. I figured well over 80%, which is what happened. And so I was comfortable with them on an individual basis. I was comfortable with them philosophically, and I thought a Republican could win in Mississippi. A lot of people didn't think so, and I can remember when I called some of my friends and supporters, they basically said, "You've blown it. You know, you're not going to be able to win." But events worked out. The people, of course, I was 31 years old, and just turned 32. But as time went on, I could sense a change in the attitude of people. When I started off, the attitude was, "No, wait a minute, you're young, you're a Republican, what is this?" But by the end, they were saying, "Well, look, I like what you're saying, and Mr. Colmer trained you, and you'll be part of the Nixon team," and I won by a pretty comfortable margin. So then I came up here, and I wanted to get on the Merchant Marine Fisheries Committee, which is a B committee, but it was important in my district. We build ships, and we've got fisheries and so forth. And I remember I probably, like every freshman, said, "I'd like to be on appropriations," and they said, "Congratulations and good luck, maybe in about 10 or 15 years." And then I think I probably requested what was then the Commerce Committee. Subsequently, it became Energy and Commerce in the House. And they basically said, once again, you are, even though you've been a staff member, you're still a freshman. And by the way, we got this really fine committee here, the Judiciary Committee. We see you were a lawyer, practiced law for a while in your hometown. That'll be a good committee for you to start on. And of course, I also had an interest in the Rules Committee to succeed Mr. Colmer. But I knew as a freshman I probably couldn't get that. So I found myself sitting on a committee with 37 other lawyers. One of the more miserable experiences I've ever endured, I might say.
When you start on this committee, you don't have any idea that this committee is going to be in the spotlight, do you?
I mean, how could I possibly have known that that would wind up being, where we had the Nixon Watergate hearings, and that I'd be sitting there voting on articles of impeachment and actually leading the argument against one of the articles of impeachment, the one having to do with the transfer of his papers to a university and getting a tax consideration for that. So I was stunned, dismayed, heartbroken, crushed, worried about the damage that was being done not only to a man that I admired, but to the presidency. And I can remember looking at the TV when he resigned and just sick.
We'll get to that in a moment. I just wanted to ask you about something that's cheerier. Tell us about the Chowder and Marching Society.
Well, again, I've had a great experience here in Washington, and I'm a peel-headed freshman. They didn't cut our hair, but in those days, you had a little bit of a pledgeship, just like you were, in some university back in the 50s or 60s. But I had been around, so I'd been around Capitol Hill. I'd been there for 4 years, and there was a bit of a novelty, I guess. Here's a guy that was, the administrative assistant, the chairman of the Rules Committee, Bill Colmer. And so when I got there, I knew people like Bill Archer and Jack Kemp, not to mention Gerald Ford and John Rhodes and Bob Michael and some of the rest of them. And soon after I got here, I think it was Bill Archer and Jack Kemp came to me and said, "We'd like you to be in this group called Chowder and Marching." And even though I'd been on Capitol Hill, I didn't know what Chowder and Marching was. I didn't, it's a Republican sort of a social or fraternal organization within House Republicans. So I talked to them about it. It seemed like a good idea, and was one of two that they selected that year early on. I think it was a congressman from California, Claire Bergener, and I were selected. They subsequently came back, and since we had such a large class, I think we had 47, picked up Jim Martin of North Carolina, who went on to be governor, Bud Schuster, who went on to be chairman of the Public Works Committee, and Dave Treen, who went on to be governor of Louisiana. So we were the five that went into Chowder Marching that year. And then I learned the history and realized that Richard Nixon had been one of the founders. And it had started in 1947 by a group of veterans, really, where they came together at 5 o'clock on a Wednesday and decided to fight a bill that would give massive pension funds to veterans. And they were all veterans, and they thought it was way too much. And that, in those days, they felt like we served because we were defending our country. You don't owe us these large amounts of money. They opposed it and defeated the bill. And therefore, they have met every Wednesday at 5 o'clock since then that Congress is in session. Jerry Ford was in that group, several cabinet secretaries, federal judges, governors, you name it. And it became a very much an important part of developing relationships, learning more about the inner workings of the Republican Party and the institution itself, because I was hearing and seeing things that I had not been able to do, even as administrative assistant to the chairman of the Rules Committee. They also helped me get on the Rules Committee. When 2 years later, when I'd spent my year in purgatory on Judiciary Committee, a vacancy occurred on Rules, and I was able to maneuver and with the support of a lot of my friends from Chowder Marching, was selected by the steering committee that made the committee assignments to go on the Rules Committee in my second term.
Did you meet alumni? Did you meet Mel Laird?
Sure. Oh, I knew Mel Laird quite well, a crusty old rascal, and he would come and he'd jump right on the neck of a freshman congressman like me. And I remember I particularly got tangled up with him in 1976 when I was pushing for Jerry Ford to come to Mississippi and to make a swing along the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Actually, I wanted him to go down the Mississippi River and pick up Democrat congressmen and senators as they went down the Mississippi and get off in somewhere in Louisiana and come across the Mississippi Gulf Coast. I thought it would be a PR bonanza. Mel Laird just completely poo-pooed it. He said, Mississippi is not going to vote for a Michigan moderate Republican over Jimmy Carter, a Southern Baptist Democrat. And I said, I'm telling you, we can carry the state for Jerry Ford. Just, stop trying to block it. Of course, he was very much involved in the Ford re-election effort. Well, I managed to help make it happen. And my predecessor, Bill Colmer, and other Democrats from Louisiana and Mississippi rode the steamboat down the Mississippi, or the paddle wheeler, and then he came across and made like 5 or 6 stops along the Mississippi Gulf Coast. And he had this very impressive young chief of staff that made the trip with him. I think he was maybe deputy chief of staff at the time by the name of Dick Cheney. And that was the first time I really ever, was exposed to Dick Cheney on a personal basis. Well, we didn't carry the state. Mel Laird was right, but we only lost it by 10,000 votes. We carried my district by 40,000. In those days, to carry Mississippi for a Republican, you had to carry my district by a 50,000 vote margin. Interestingly enough, when Ronald Reagan ran in 1980, we carried the state by 10,000 votes.
Actually, since we're talking about that, did you play a role in his decision to open his campaign in Philadelphia?
Yes, I did. I had a lot to do with that. It never dawned on me it was going to be played in the New York Times like it was. I remember we wanted it to become, because it's called Mississippi's biggest political house party. Candidates of all stripes come. Dukakis came. Jack Kemp came. Lots of Democrats, lots of Republicans. So it was not unusual for Democrats and Republicans to come to the Neshoba County Fair. But I remember Jim Baker did not want him to come, and I kept pushing for it. The big debate, though, was that I wanted to give him a rocker made by a famous rocking chair artist in Mississippi. And we wanted to present it to him at the fair. And, oh, no, they did not want that. No. They were worried about the age thing. So they resisted. By the way, in Mississippi, I was the Reagan chairman, but my 3 co-chairmen were 3 former Democrat congressmen. Tom Abernathy of North Mississippi, John Bell Williams, who went on to be governor after he basically got stripped of his seniority for voting for Goldwater, and Bill Colmer. They were all on the platform.
Bill Colmer, how old was he by then?
Well, Bill Colmer lived to be 92 after retiring at 82. So, but he counseled with me. I remember I went to see him in September of the 80 election and said, give me advice about how to carry Mississippi for Reagan. I'm pretty sure it was in September, and he gave me some good, sound, solid advice, which I followed to the T, and we wound up carrying the state. But the end of the story about the rocker was they had basically said no. Well, in those days, I was pretty ornery, and I had my own ideas about how things would look and how it would work. So sure enough, when he comes, and Nancy's with him. And so we put the rocker up on the platform, and I present the rocker to him, even though they had not agreed to that. Reagan walked over, sat down in the rocker, and I'm sure his staff was going, oh, no, there he is, old man Reagan sitting in that rocker. He reaches over, grabs Nancy Reagan by the hand, pulls her down in his lap, and that was the picture that went all across America. This young, dude's put the move on his wife in his rocking chair. But of course, others said, "Oh no, that was it was a racist place, and he shouldn't have gone there." And he talked about states' rights too, by the way. But other candidates of all philosophical persuasions have come before and since.
Before we move on, did you meet Bryce Harlow?
I did. I met Bryce Harlow in the late 60s or early 70s when I worked with Mr. Colmer. And I have told the story, and I may have even written about it in my book, but Congressman Colmer, a Democrat, dearly loved Bryce Harlow. And Bryce, I remember, would come to his office and just very unassumingly ask if he could see the chairman, and would go in there and sit down with Mr. Colmer, and just, Mr. Colmer just loved him, because he said he basically said that this defines how you should be a lobbyist, or you should work for the White House or the Congress. Be humble and unassuming, be honest, reach out to everybody. And from that day to this, I consider Bryce Harlow is the example of how a Congressional Relations Office should work, or how a lobby should work. And every year they give awards in the name of and the honor of Bryce Harlow. But he was just, he was not a big, handsome, articulate, overwhelming, political personality. He was a very small, unassuming, but tremendously effective and honorable man.
Well, Senator Alexander said the same thing about him.
Yeah.
Now we have to go into purgatory. I apologize. Tell us about, after the Saturday Night Massacre, there was a lot of pressure on the Judiciary Committee to get an investigation going. Yeah. In the book, you write that you brushed it off as long as you could.
Yeah.
How did you do that?
I did. Well, I really, I thought this was just a political gambit to try to tarnish him, or to try to get President Nixon. I still, admired him and looked up to him, and I thought that a lot of their allegations, you're going to impeach him for bombing of Cambodia, you're going to impeach him for giving his papers to a university and getting a tax deduction. As a matter of fact, I knew that could be done because I had done it with Mr. Colmer's papers. I actually knew what the law was because I'd already dealt with that. So I thought of it, a lot of it was just mean-spirited, partisan Democrat politics. And by the way, remember now, I sat over there on the Democratic side in the House as a staff member, and I never was comfortable with them. Not only philosophically, just their approach. It was just a negative and a mean-spiritedness about it that I did not agree with. So I resisted right across the board. I was identified, I think, as one of the 10 hardheads on the Judiciary Committee, because not all Republicans took that position. The guy that sat right next to me was Bill Cohen, the only guy in the House younger than I was at the time, a congressman from Maine, and right next to him was one from Virginia by the name of Carlos Moorhead, both of whom started to get a little shaky on some of the articles of impeachment. And I remember there were some run-up procedural votes before we got to the votes on the articles of impeachment, and I remember turning to Bill Cohen and saying, "Oh, hey, Bill, please at least stick with us on the procedural votes." He didn't do it. So he and I had a long relationship. Wound up in the Senate, wound up being good friends, and I think he always supported me in my leadership roles in the Senate, partially because of what we knew about each other from the past. But I resisted all of that, and I was sided more with a congressman that I admired very much by the name of Chuck Wiggins from California, went on to be a federal judge, I believe. Charlie Sandman from New Jersey, and several others. Carlos Moorhead, but let me go back and correct that.
It's Caldwell Butler, right?
Caldwell Butler from Virginia.
Yeah.
Carlos Moorhead was from California, that was with me, but Caldwell Butler was on the other side. And But finally, I remember, I got a call I'll never forget now from a Mississippian that was working at the White House, and I was in Destin, Florida, on vacation with my family, and he said, "This is something I think you should read." And I think he maybe even described it as a smoking gun. And so I got on a plane, flew back in. He met me at the Baltimore airport. It's the only way I could get in late at night. And I actually read it by car light on the way back to Washington. And it was obvious to me now, at that point, that one article of impeachment for obstruction of justice was going to be unavoidable. So I basically acknowledged that I would support that one article of impeachment. I actually had one newspaper in my district, and ironically, the name of the paper was the Poplarville Democrat, who wrote an editorial condemning me for not sticking with Nixon.
Wow.
Even at that point.
Well, you wrote a statement on, I think it was August 5th, when the tape came out, to say that though you had voted against all three articles of impeachment.
I voted against all of the articles of impeachment on the Judiciary Committee. Yeah.
But you said that when it went to the House, you would vote for.
Yeah.
That must have been very difficult.
It was very difficult, very difficult. And but at that point, there weren't but about two or three still resisting.
So did you talk to Wiggins and Sandman and Moorhead at this time? I mean, did they come to the same conclusion as you? Did you?
In retrospect, I can't recall whether I specifically talked to each one of them about that. I may have, but I'm not sure I did. I think I came to that conclusion on my own and probably wrote that a statement on my own.
Tell us a little bit about Lawrence Hogan and Congressman Railsback.
Well, they also were interesting studies. Railsback, as I recall, from Illinois, tried to stick with Nixon. He was also in Chowder marching. So we had a relationship with Nixon socially in that form, but he was struggling with the issue and was more inclined than some of the rest of us to oppose all the articles of impeachment. And the other one,
Hogan.
Hogan from Maryland, was an interesting study. I think he started off pretty much a hardliner, but then began to soften up as we got on in toward actually voting on the articles of impeachment. I'm not sure he ever voted for the articles of impeachment, but I think Railsback was having a little influence on him.
Do you remember? First of all, let me ask you about John Doerr.
Yeah.
What do you remember of John Doerr and his efforts to give you information?
Not a whole lot, except that I had a negative reaction to him from the beginning. I was not a big fan of John Doerr either.
And Rodino?
He was the chairman. I thought he ran a fair hearing in that he gave everybody their chance to be heard, but it was obvious to me from early on that he intended to impeach him.
Do you remember seeing the Watergate Special Prosecution Force, Leon Jaworski, handed over what was described as a roadmap? It was about a 120-page document with all of the information they had on the cover-up, which was handed to your committee. Do you recall looking?
I do remember that, and I remember Jaworski's, and he was from Texas, wasn't he?
Yes, he was, sir.
And highly respected, and not thought of as a terrible partisan, more of a Texas kind of Democrat. But I remember thinking at the time it was pretty devastating material that he gave us.
You got a very dramatic you had a very dramatic conversation with Gerald Ford that summer.
Actually, that conversation, I think I talked about it in my book, Herding Cats. So we were at a Chowder marching event, social event, and we were out by the swimming pool having cocktails late, I'm sure Wednesday. And it was during the processes of the Judiciary Committee, and I was having some pretty, profound statements about my support, my determination, how bad it was. And I remember him saying basically, be careful what you say, or I can't remember the exact words, but don't get too far out on that limb. And I remember it struck me like a bolt of lightning. You know, I'm hearing this from the vice president. What does he know? Well, now, I never have forgotten that.
Well,
You give me some water.
sorry. Let's stop for a minute.
I remember it almost just took my breath away from me. I just stood there and looked at him and thought a lot about it, remembered it over and over and over again as the events went forward.
Now, you still voted against, because the articles of impeachment, I think the vote came after this meeting, didn't it?
Oh, yeah, they did. I'm sure that they did. This would have been probably in I'd say mid-July, and I think that the votes on the articles, didn't they actually come after that in
Sure
late
did.
July? Yeah, but it was, it had not gotten as deep into the weeds as it did after he told me that. But it was the first warning I had from anybody, be careful.
Did you have a group, because we've interviewed Senator Cohen on the group that worked together.
Yeah.
Did you meet with Congressman Wiggins? And
Yeah, you know, I talked a lot. Of course, he was the one I really looked to, because I thought he was the best lawyer on the committee. I thought he was our most effective speaker. So yeah, I made it a point of talking to him and talking to the people down the line on the Republican side. I mean, I was beginning my instincts as a whip, trying to hold our ranks together, and I was having trouble with those guys right up the line for me a little bit. That I already mentioned, Bill Cohen and Caldwell Butler and Rails, and I guess even to a degree, Hogan was getting to be a problem. And of course, our ranking member was Hutchinson from Michigan, who was solid as a rock from our standpoint, but was not he was clearly not the leader of our side. The leaders were clearly Chuck Wiggins and Charles Sandman.
You write about a little bit about Agnew in your book. You get off a bit on a limb about Agnew.
Oh yes, I did that too. Yeah. You know, I had taken a trip with a group of Republican staff members in 1970. When would that have been? I think it was late '60s. But they did not like Agnew even then, and they were mad at Nixon too, because they didn't feel like he was sufficiently conservative enough. Remember now, Nixon's a guy that created EPA. I mean, he was pretty moderate on a lot of subjects. So they were unhappy. I wound up working for a Democrat staffer, a Democrat congressman, arguing with all the Republican staffers in defense of Nixon and Agnew. So, and I again, when it all started out, I had no idea, what he had been engaged in, and I was once again shocked at what happened, but pleased that Gerald Ford would be selected out of Chowder marching to be vice president. I actually voted. That was the first time that article of the Constitution was used, and so I actually voted in support of Gerald Ford's selection to be vice president. And by the way, I had to do it again later with Nelson Rockefeller.
Oh, right. In your book, you write, after you describe your reaction to President Nixon's resignation speech, you write, "This was a constitutional crisis, and I had contributed to it."
Yeah.
What did you mean by that?
Well, I had been there on the Judiciary Committee. In some respects, I thought maybe I had not, asked the right questions, but I also had put out that statement saying that based on what I had learned, that obstruction of justice was a legitimate charge, and I felt badly about even doing that. And here's a guy that had an influence on my decision to run for office, and was helpful in my winning, and that I looked up to as the president. And I wound up then having to sit in judgment on him, and eventually even having to say that I would vote for an article of impeachment. I felt devastated by that. I wondered if I'd ever get over it politically. I didn't know how it was going to play out in my congressional district, because my district had been like 84% or something like that voted for Nixon, And it was a mixed reaction as to how they reacted to Watergate and his resignation. It was potentially going to be a real political problem for me. But one of the things I've said, and I'm not sure I put it in my book, but it was certainly an interesting and a trying experience. But for the next 35 years, it was all easy. After that, nothing was more trying and more disappointing than that experience. And I went through a lot of things over the years, including the impeachment and the trial of William Jefferson Clinton.
Well, I read those chapters, though that sounded pretty trying. You
It was
almost
very
lost your
trying.
caucus.
Very trying. Yeah, I did. I was always trying to find a way to deal with our constitutional responsibility. It was trying, though, more in terms of trying to deal with the constitutional questions, deal with the scheduling, deal with how you set it up, how did we get through it in a timely way and come out the back end where you could still do some things for your country. But it didn't drain me the way the Nixon matter did. Partially because I think I was a lot older. I had a lot of experience under my belt. Yes, I did almost have a revolution in my own caucus, but I don't mind getting in trouble by commissions. It's omissions. I mean, I was trying to find a way to work through an extremely difficult thing. And the caucus didn't agree with some of the ideas that I tried to put together. I found the best minds I could in the Senate, but I never felt personally that as just devastated. It wasn't just because in this case I was actually trying to get through the process. Now I was accused by some people of, oh no, if you really wanted to, you could have removed him from office. So again, I knew from the beginning we were not, because I was a vote counter by then. By then I'd been whipping the House for 8 years during the Reagan years. I'd been whipping the Senate for a year and a half. I'd been leader for several years. I knew how to count votes, and I knew the votes were not there to remove President Clinton from office. So it was always a question of, how can we get the facts? How can we present this properly in a dignified way without demeaning the institution, but in a period of time that was reasonable, but not one that goes on for months and months. And then when we get through, be able to say to one and all, we did our job, we did it the best we could, and now let's go forward. And I think we achieved that. So I always felt that I did the best I could as leader during that difficult process. I did not feel the same way after the Nixon matter. It was just so much more emotional for me. Maybe because I was 32, 33 years old. I'd never seen anything like that. I never dreamed anything like that would happen. But by the time the Clinton trial came around, I'd seen about everything that you could see politically and legislatively.
In your book, you say that you think that there were the votes to impeach President Nixon.
Yeah.
But there weren't the votes to impeach President Clinton. What's the difference?
I just think that in the House there would have been enough votes to vote for the impeachment of the president, because Republicans, and by then, probably, the majority of the Republican conference had come to the conclusion that he had made mistakes or broken the law, and he was going to get through the House. And then, of course, you had in the Senate people that were close friends of Nixon's that, went to him and basically said, the jig is up. Now, this is going to sound partisan, but I never thought that there were enough Democrats in the Senate that would vote to remove Bill Clinton from office no matter what he had done. I looked at them individually. I counted them repeatedly. I listened to what they had to say for the slightest little sign. There were a few little signs early on, I think Tom Daschle was very uncomfortable with all of that. There's no question Joe Lieberman made some speeches that were pretty tough. But one of the ones I was watching for a reaction was Bob Byrd. And when he started signaling where he was, I knew it was over. There were no Democrats that could go to Bill Clinton and say to him what that group of Republican senators did and said to Richard Nixon. And, you know, I think when you get in trouble, I've learned over the years, it's better to be a Democrat. Because Republicans will shove you over the cliff if you make a mistake. Democrats will surround you and protect you.
I'm going to step back for a moment, because you're going to see there are going to be some kids who watch this, students who watch this 25 years from now. Please compare and contrast the constitutional crises of the Clinton one versus Nixon. I mean, are they both of the same seriousness?
You know, I voted for articles of impeachment of Clinton, and I would have voted for the one on Nixon. I do think that there was more of a constitutional crisis with Nixon than there was with Clinton. Maybe it was the times. Maybe it was the break-in and the illegal aspects of it. Maybe it was what the tapes revealed in terms of his discussions and you know, the effort to cover it up in several different ways. I also think that you know, I voted what I thought was the right thing with Clinton for some of the articles of impeachment. I mean, most people, if you lied to a grand jury, that's a crime. People have been removed from the federal courts for lying to a grand jury about a crime that you were found innocent of. And I felt like he didn't tell the truth there. I think the differences were, though, to a degree, I don't know why you would differentiate these, but one of them is, you know, about human relationships, sex, if you will. And the other one is about breaking the law in terms of something like as serious as obstruction of justice. So I really think that, you know, the Nixon matter and the timing, the Vietnam War, all that was going on, all that had gone on, was a part of the atmosphere that we were still dealing with.
You write in your book that this was a watershed for you. And you imply, because the next chapter is on Reagan, that this pushed you towards Reagan in some sense.
Yeah, it did. I supported Gerald Ford because I thought Gerald Ford did a very good job coming in with the circumstances that he came in with. I'll never forget his first State of the Union address, which he said, "I'm a Ford, not a Lincoln." And I thought that was very good. I mean, he was basically saying, look, I'm not the top of the line here necessarily. I wasn't elected to this office. I was, you know, selected and confirmed, but and I'm not a fancy guy. And you know, in these media times, it was just an humbling thing. I thought he tried I think he did kind of reinstate faith in people and his basic goodness and the effort of the goodness of the government to do the right thing. I thought he did the right thing by pardoning Nixon. But, and so, because of the circumstances he came in under, because he was the incumbent, and because I had a relationship with him, I admit, from Chowder and marching and on a personal basis, I supported him for, you know, election as president in 1976. But my heart was really with Reagan even then. But I felt like Ford deserved a chance after what he'd been through to try to get it in his own right for 4 years. So after, you know, 4 years, I was very, very anxious to get on board with Reagan. I thought we needed Reagan. I thought it gave me a chance to make up what I felt like I had to do for President Ford. And so I committed to him early, like in December of 1979. And by the spring, I was his chairman in Mississippi. So I was excited about that. I thought he was what we needed at the time. It also gave me a chance to sort of salve my conscience for what I had done in 1976. Even though I endorsed him and tried to be helpful, I didn't go to the convention just because I couldn't couldn't stand the thought of all I knew was going to happen at the Republican convention in 1976.
In your book, you give the impression that you might have actually switched the Mississippi delegation, in which case Reagan might have been nominated.
The vote by the Mississippi delegation was 17 to 16 in favor of the Ford position. If I'd been there and voted my conscience, I'd have probably switched that vote the other way.
What did you mean, though, in the book when you said that your Watergate Judiciary Committee experience was a watershed? What did that mean?
Well, it's just that it had so many profound effects on me, both in terms of what I was exposed to, and the disappointment, but the learning that I went through, and how the media conducts itself. It really showed me the partisan side of Congress, the ugly side of Congress too, quite frankly. It made me a pretty tough partisan for a long time. I became a partisan warrior in the House as a Republican and as a Republican whip. I mean, I was a loyalist and considered myself a Reagan lieutenant, but I was a pretty hard-nosed partisan Republican. I really did not respect the Democrats, lost a lot of respect for a lot of them, and developed quite a dislike for them in the House. And it took me probably, 15 years or more, 20 years to get over that. And I didn't get over it until I got in the House, still was thinking very much as a partisan, in the Senate. Moved over to the Senate in 1988, saw a lot of things like I saw in the House that I didn't like, but then I started out trying to change it. And as the years went by, and when you get in these leadership positions, you can be a partisan warrior and get nothing accomplished, or you learn how to work with people, both parties. You learn how to begin to forge a bipartisan coalition. You learn how to reach out, and by the Clinton years, my attitude had changed somewhat. But clearly, a defining moment in my political career was that first 2 years and the Nixon impeachment hearing.
It's interesting, though, that you do mention, though, your disappointment at the smoking gun tape. So I wondered if that also had.
It did. I was obviously disappointed and really upset at what had happened there and what I was afraid it was going to do to my country. It made me not cynical, but it always made me make sure when I was told something in the political arena or in Washington, the legislative arena, of its veracity. I have a lot of sayings or anecdotes that I collected over the years. And one of them is that in Washington, it's always about something else. What that means is what congressmen or senators are telling you the reason is why they're doing something. It's probably not the real reason. It's probably something else over here. And the current debate about automobile situation is a pretty good example. Some people say it's it's about the workers or you're opposed to bailouts, but it's really about who do you represent.
The gentleman who called you on July 31st or August 1st, was that Gene Ainsworth?
Yeah, Gene Ainsworth had been administrative assistant to former Congressman Sonny Montgomery, a Democrat. We had become very close friends and came up here about the same time. And I had worked on him. He was with me at the luncheon the day I officially converted to being a Republican. There were other events that led to it, but there was a moment when I actually said it out loud. I don't agree with anything that's been said in this room. I am a Republican. He was with me that day. And then subsequently, he wound up going to work at the White House in congressional relations during the Ford administration, and just working so hard. And he was the one that they tasked to call me and say, you need to be aware of this.
So he was working for Bill Timmons at that point? In the Nixon administration?
He was I guess it was the Nixon administration. Yeah,
it was still
yeah, that's right. I jumped over the Ford administration, but you're right. It was toward the end of the Nixon administration. yeah.
So he was in Timmons' shop.
Yeah, he was in Timmons' shop.
Oh, and that's really.
You know, I got to remember get my dates and people right.
That's all right.
After all,
It's
that
easier
was,
for me.
36 years ago.
Yeah, I know. Is there an anecdote that we have not preserved that you would like to add?
Yeah, I'd like to add one. I kept my relationship up with Nixon over the years. I still admired him for his knowledge of the world situation and his leadership. I remember when Reagan was going to send troops into Grenada. I was not sure this was a good idea. So I called Nixon. Now, by then, I am the whip for the Republicans in the House. So I called President Nixon. He took the call, and I said, I don't know much about what's going on here, about this part of the world. Is this the right thing? And should I come out for it? And he gave me a little history lesson and said, absolutely, it's the right thing to do, and you ought to come out there immediately for it. And boy, I put out a statement and immediately, and was very supportive of the effort. He would still come to occasionally to Chowder marching meetings or to events. And I remember when I was elected to the Senate in 1988, he had done a fundraiser for me on an Amway yacht in New York Harbor. And I guess I had sent him a copy of a picture with my wife and with him on the boat. After I got elected, I got from him, after the election, the picture of the three of us with, I think, with the Statue of Liberty in the background in the harbor, and with a note on it, congratulations, and all of those that were elected, I think you have the best chance of rising to leadership.
Wow. By the way, why were you?
And it really struck me at the time. And so until way on, until he got, really in poor health, I would periodically call and seek his advice. I admired it.
It's been a while, but Senator Lott, why did you have doubts about Grenada?
I just didn't know anything about what was going on there. I don't remember why, whether there was that much of a run-up or not, but I remember I just wasn't sure that direct military action was really called for. And, even though I'm a Republican and had been supportive of the Vietnam War, and over the years I learned, don't just jump out there when a military action is involved and say, oh yeah, this is a good idea. Just take your time and check it out a little bit. And I think that was it. I wasn't sure why that was the right move. Didn't know a lot about the region, and I figured he would, and he did.
When Iran-Contra happened, did you use some of your Watergate experience to give counsel to the Reagan administration?
I probably did, and I'm sure whatever advice I gave was probably along the lines, be careful about what you say and what you do. Don't underestimate this. Bring in strong people. And so I was very pleased when Howard Baker agreed to go in there and close things out. Remember, the first 6 years of Reagan, we had won almost every legislative battle, even though we were in a very small minority. Throughout the 80s, right on into 86, but beginning in 87, the wheels started coming off. And in retrospect, I think by 88, President Reagan was showing some of the effects of what he had to deal with later on. And I was in some of those meetings where the Iran-Contra thing was talked about, and I was very nervous about it, and really liked the fact that he brought in some really senior people to get him through that last year without just total disgrace.
We had an opportunity to interview Vice President Cheney for the project. Did your having met him on that trip in Mississippi help you years later when he would be vice president and you were in the Senate?
Well, I remember that experience, and he always remembered it fondly. And then Of course, he served as chief of staff to Gerald Ford, got to know him, and marvel at what a good job this very young man from Wyoming was doing with Gerald Ford. And then, of course, a year or so after that, 2 years, I guess, he wound up getting elected to the House. And I had been in the House by then for 6 years, but was very impressed with him and developed a friendship with him. And by the 80s, we were both in the leadership together. And my wife always just loved Lynn, and we wound up going out to Wyoming and speaking to a Lincoln Day dinner for him at Jackson, Wyoming, and snowmobiling and skiing. And so we developed a real friendship during that period of time. And of course then, so I guess we served in the leadership together for 8 years during the Reagan era. And then, of course, he was my successor as whip when I got elected to the Senate. Of course, he says that he had a 100% record of winning every issue while he was whip. Of course, they never had a single vote while he was whip because he went on to be confirmed as Secretary of Defense. And so our relationship continued, and it does to this very day. We were with Dick and Lynn last Monday night, and we're good friends aside from all of our political activities.
Senator Lott, thank you for your time.
Okay.
It's been excellent.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks, sir.
All right.